Marie Kolbeck, right over there, is our new admissions director, and we are glad to have you here today and to get to know you a little bit. We created this great series for you guys to come and, one, understand perhaps some areas of law that maybe you weren't familiar with and delve into that a little bit, and two, get acquainted with our awesome faculty here at the law school. She was the notes chair of the Harvard Law Review, a senior editor of the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, and an editor of the Harvard Journal of Law and Technology. She also clerked for Judge J. Michael Ludig of the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and then for Justice Anthony Kennedy, Supreme Court. Professor Sun was a lecturer in law at Stanford Law School, where she taught federal jurisdiction and administrative law, and she spent 2 years in Beijing, China, where she taught civil procedure to Chinese judges, lawyers, and administrative officials as a visiting professor at the Temple Xinjiao University. Tsinghua. I don't know Chinese. While in China, Professor Sun served as an advisor and consultant to the Peking University Law Review and the other University Law Review as well. That is a really hard language. She is very smart. Professor Sun also worked as a consultant for many law firms on appellate briefs and Supreme Court petitions, and has served as a pro bono lawyer on constitutional, administrative, bankruptcy, and family law matters. And here at the law school, she teaches classes in disaster law, constitutional law, administrative law, and torts. And hopefully you will be able to you'll enjoy her presentation today, and hopefully you'll be able to come and enjoy her classes at law school. So I would like to give Professor Sun.
So most of that probably means nothing to you, which is great. What I love about being here is I get to think about really interesting things. So I want to start my presentation today by taking you back to a time that some of you might not even remember that well. Hurricane Katrina in 2005. It was in fall, late August, September 2005. Do any of you remember Hurricane Katrina happening? I know you guys are all getting younger. I'm getting older. So for some of you, it was probably a little bit of a distant memory. I was actually in Beijing at the time, living in a hotel where we were trying to get moved in to the place that we were going to live with our family. And what was on TV the whole time we were in the hotel was coverage of Hurricane Katrina. And this is a picture of New Orleans a couple of days after the hurricane made landfall. And eventually 80% of the city was underwater. And you got the sense, if you watched the news coverage, that New Orleans was sinking not just into the water, into the mud and all of the very dirty, toxic water, but into chaos and anarchy and despair. Here is a British tabloid coverage some of the events that happened, and it's titled Our Hell in the Terror Dome. And it's referring to people's experiences as they reported them in a Superdome, which was a shelter of last resort in New Orleans. It was the place that you went if you couldn't stay in your home and you needed to evacuate. It was the public shelter that a lot of people ended up in. So you get this title, Hurricane Brits Tell of Child Rape, Crazed Gun Gangs, and Crack Addicts. This description of the horrible conditions that were reported in the Superdome. And lest you think that this was just the province of British tabloids, you also got this sense of New Orleans sinking into this kind of despair and anarchy, even from New Orleans public officials. So this is New Orleans Police Superintendent P. Edward Compass, and this is him on the Oprah Winfrey Show. He said, "Little babies are getting raped in the Superdome." And then New Orleans Mayor Ray Nagin said, hurricane survivors have descended into an almost animalistic state after days of watching hooligans killing people and raping people. And just for good measure, we got the same kind of coverage from some of our most respected media sources. The New York Times said, New Orleans is a snake pit of anarchy, death, looting, raping, marauding thugs, suffering innocents, a shattered police force, insufficient troop levels, and criminally negligent government planning. The normally fairly staid Financial Times of London said girls and boys were raped in the dark and had their throats cut, and bodies were stuffed in the kitchens while looters and madmen exchanged fire with weapons that they had looted. Finally, the Washington Post drew extensively on the idea that New Orleans was like a war zone. It was exactly the same for soldiers who were there policing the grounds as it had been in Baghdad. So they said their title was Troops Back from Iraq, Find Another War Zone. In New Orleans, it's like Baghdad on a bad day. And also, if you were watching the coverage, you saw that sort of the 24/7 loop on a lot of the cable news stations was coverage of looting in Gulf states, that people were overtaking stores, that they were running off with color TVs, that this was the state that New Orleans was in. And you got this fairly unrelenting picture of New Orleans as this crazy, chaotic place. Did any of you remember that coverage? Is that sort of your perception of what happened in New Orleans? To the extent that you have one. So it turns out that a large percentage of this coverage was simply untrue. The crime statistics about the deaths and the looting, for the most part, never materialized, and most of this ended up not being substantiated. And about a month after Hurricane Katrina, you started getting major news outlets, including the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, the Washington Post, issuing retractions of a lot of their earlier coverage. So this is one in a local New Orleans newspaper. They said, the picture that emerged from all of this news coverage was one of impoverished masses of flood victims resorting to utter depravity, randomly attacking each other, as well as police officers trying to save them, to protect them, and the rescue workers trying to save them. 4 weeks after the storm, so about a month later, few of the widely reported atrocities have been backed with evidence. The piles of bodies never materialized, and soldiers, police officers, and rescue personnel on the front lines say that although anarchy reigned at times and people suffered unimaginable indignities, most of the worst crimes reported at the time never happened. So we got all of these sort of media mea culpas. We've exaggerated. It turns out a lot of this wasn't true. But why were public officials so quick to report and the public so almost eager to believe, or at least willing to believe, all of these stories about terrible atrocities coming out of New Orleans? Well, it turns out that while these stories weren't consistent for the most part with the truth, they were consistent with a set of misconceptions that sociologists, and I've talked to a couple of you already who are sociology majors, that sociologists have identified as common misconceptions about the way that people typically respond to disasters. And they've identified these disconnects between the ways that people expect people to behave after disasters and the ways that people actually do generally behave after disasters as disaster myths. And they say there's 3 really common ones. There's some other ones as well, but the ones I focused on are the myth of widespread violence and crime. That it's really a typical reaction after a disaster to have a lot of looting, to have a lot of violence, where people are taking advantage of the situation, where there are fewer police, more opportunities to engage in all kinds of violent conduct. The myth of panic, and that people just can't think straight, that they're going to react in really irrational ways, that they're going to flee in ways that are dangerous to themselves or others, and the myth of shock and psychological dependency. The idea that people won't be able to think for themselves, and they really need strong leaders to step in and tell them what to do if the community is going to respond effectively. So most of these sort of characteristics that people think our behavior is going to exhibit after a disaster sort of take a page from a disaster movie script. So to think about your favorite disaster movies, and this is a really popular genre in the United States, really interestingly, it doesn't have an equivalent to most other countries. I went to a conference with European disaster law scholars, and we talked about the fact that they could only come up with one movie that seemed even vaguely like a disaster movie. But here in the U.S., we have a lot of interesting kind of disaster movies, and they tend to run along similar lines. You have these disaster victims who are plunged into this lawless, chaotic world where human depravity is sort of really being manifest. And these disaster victims either flee in panic and they kind of scramble over victims in this desperate attempt to save themselves, or they curl up in fetal position and they just can't muster the will to go on. And if we're going to get saved at all, it's by some hero that sort of rises above this kind of base human nature and is the leader for all of us and takes charge and steps into this void and sort of leads the helpless masses. It turns out that if you study disasters in sociology textbooks, you get a quite different, and certainly maybe less interesting from a news headlines kind of perspective, but more comforting from a humanitarian perspective, picture of how people actually react. That in general, disaster survivors don't devolve into their worst selves. Antisocial behavior happens. It happens all the time. But it's more of an exception. It's more like everyday kind of behavior. Victims generally don't panic. They usually try to assess their circumstances and act accordingly, much as they would in any other circumstances. And that disaster victims are actually the true first responders. If you look at statistics about who actually is saved after disasters, the vast majority of people are saved by family members, by neighbors, by other community members, not by official first responders like police and fire agents, because they get there too late most of the time to make a difference, and there aren't the numbers of them that would really be required to muster an effective response. So it's really the people on the ground who, for the most part, kind of pull together as a community and act in ways that are pro-social. They try to help each other and try to start sort of rebuilding their community. So why does any of this matter, and what does it have to do with the law? This is the question I always get on the first day of my disaster law class. All these interesting disasters, right? But what does it have to do with the law? And it turns out that disasters in general have a lot to do with the law, how we insure them, why we let people build where they build, what kind of requirements we have about zoning and information disclosure, land use questions. We have a lot of interesting questions, all of which are very fraught with the law. But in this context, what does any of this have to do with the law? So I've identified, as I've gone through this is part of my scholarly work, to think about these misconceptions we have about disasters and how they translate into the laws that we have. And it turns out it actually raises some fairly deep questions about how we legislate and how we make rules for normal times. Do we make rules that respond to what people should be afraid of? Or do we make rules that respond to what people are actually afraid of? So it's a really interesting question. And as I've gone through this in my research, there are a number of things that I've identified as consequences in our legal system of the fact that we tend to believe in this disaster mythology and that we credit it more than we should. Because law is basically the way we respond to things, policies sort of written into formulations that we try to follow in large respects. So one of the major impacts that this disaster mythology has is on the way that we use our military in disaster relief. So you can have all kinds of different conceptions of what the military should do after a disaster. The military should be there helping out, they should be distributing food, they should be clearing roads, or you can think of our federal military as disaster police. That the local police officers are going to be overwhelmed, and there's going to be all this looting and violence, and we need extra boots on the ground to really respond. So an image of the federal military is disaster police, or more as relief workers that are helping people sort of along the way. And it turns out the way we use our military is very much dictated by the legal statutes that we have in place. So you have a series of statutes with sort of a complex interplay that help the president decide how he can use the military. So we have one statute, the Stafford Act, which is the major disaster relief statute. So whenever you hear the president declare a natural disaster or a major disaster or declare an emergency, he's referencing his power under the Stafford Act. And the Stafford Act says to the president, you can use the military to do a variety of humanitarian things. They can distribute food and medicine. They can be engaged in search and rescue. They can clear roads. They can clear access points. All of those things are something you can use the military to do. But there's also an old law called the Posse Comitatus Act. And posses are exactly what it sounds like when the sheriff rounds up people to help him execute the law. So this law actually came out of military reconstruction. And it says that the military was being used in the South, Southern senators didn't like this, to enforce voting laws and other things. And you got a prohibition that came out of this that said, unless Congress or the Constitution specifically says so, you cannot use federal military as law enforcement. They can't function as domestic police and enforce the law. That's the sort of general background about how we can use our military. There's also an exception, a permission in the law to use our military under certain circumstances, and that's basically to quell insurrections domestic violence is the term, one of the terms in the Act, or to prevent obstructions to federal law. So if you view the world through the myth that disasters commonly engender looting and violence and craziness and obstructions to federal law, and something that looks like even what we consider a term of art, domestic violence, how does that affect how we use the military, given that background? What do you think? If you think what's happening on the ground is that kind of chaos, does the president have the permission to use the military as disaster police?
Yes, because it could easily be considered a disaster.
Okay, considered a disaster, and if you look at the language, right, the Posse Comitatus Act says you have to have statutory permission to use our military as police, or even disaster police, right? But here in the Insurrection Act, we have such a permission. So if you can identify domestic violence, craziness on the ground, things that obstruct the president from enforcing federal law, then you can invoke this, and you can make our federal military into a law enforcement agency domestically and use them domestically in that way. Is that what you meant?
Yes.
Okay, so there's a quite different way of using our military if what you think is happening on the ground is that kind of chaos. So one thing that comes out of this is that the president can decide both to federalize the National Guard, because that's one of the things he can do when he invokes this act, but also to turn our federal military generally into disaster police. And to my mind, he's a little bit too likely to do that because there's this perception that all this violence is happening on the ground. And so that trigger seems to be more easily satisfied in a disaster if we look at disaster through the lens of this myth than if we have a more accurate understanding of what's actually happening on the ground. Now, the flip side to this is if the president, for some reason, is nervous about invoking the Insurrection Act, he doesn't want to say that what we have going on down there in Louisiana, despite all the news reports, is actually domestic violence. He doesn't want to take over the National Guard from the state. He might be reluctant then to send troops in to do humanitarian jobs. Why? So this is actually kind of what happened in New Orleans. There was a big debate between Governor Blanco, she's the commander of the Louisiana National Guard, and President Bush. And he wanted her to relinquish authority. He wanted to turn the federal military and her National Guard into a law enforcement function and sort of control the streets. And she said, no, I'm not going to relinquish the Guard. Now, he had the ability, if he invoked the Insurrection Act, to override her, potentially, and take control of the Guard and make the federal military the main law enforcement that was happening in New Orleans. But politically, that was going to have a lot of fallout for him. His advisor said, you can't, as a political matter, seize control from a female Democratic governor without there being too much political fallout. So he decided, I'm not going to invoke the Insurrection Act. This is what the papers show from some Freedom of Information Act requests later about what actually happened. So he said, I'm not going to invoke it. But because I'm not going to invoke it, now I'm really nervous because you're asking me to commit all of these troops down there to do things like feed people and distribute food, and I'm worried about their safety. I'm worried they're going to get into situations where they're going to need their guns, and either they're not going to have them, or they're going to have them and they're going to use them in contradiction of this set of federal law. So a kind of interesting bind that the president found himself in because of this perception that what was happening down there was this kind of looting and violence, and that the security situation had really spun out of control. Another thing that happens because of this myth is we have all of these plans in place. The federal government has all kinds of priorities about where it's going to distribute food and how it's going to do that. But if you think again that what's happening on the ground is a lot of violence, it changes how we prioritize things and how we use our resources. So this happens at the local level too. A couple of days after Hurricane Katrina made landfall, Mayor Ray Nagin took all of the remaining police officers in New Orleans, and the numbers were about 1,500 people at that point, and he said, no more search and rescue. What we need is looting control. So everybody who's currently engaged in search and rescue, you're now redirected to patrolling the streets, keeping them safe from looters. And that was because, again, of this perception that all of this violence was happening and that looting was a huge problem. The same thing happened to a certain extent when they decided to deliver goods, sanitation, food, and water to the Superdome and the Convention Center, which again were these shelters of last resort. And here's a picture. It looks really sort of pretty in a way with all that sunlight coming through from a distance. Concept turned out not to be such a lovely experience. There wasn't a lot of violence happening, but despite the rumors, but it was sort of horrific in terms of the actual living conditions. You had a lot of people who needed medical attention who weren't getting it, not enough food and water, and definitely a real lack of adequate sanitation. But what happened was by the time they managed to assemble the supplies to deliver them, and it took a while to assemble the supplies because truck drivers stopped about 30 miles outside of New Orleans who'd heard these rumors and said, we go no further. If you want these goods, federal government, figure out someone to come pick them up because we are not going into that city. But once they finally got the supplies there, they waited another day or two in order to assemble large regiments of police officers and military to go in as an armed escort to deliver the goods. Because what they expected to find was gangs having taken over the Superdome with all of these weapons who were going to fight to hold on to their territory. Instead, when they finally went in there with these big regiments, they secured the entire Superdome in about half an hour. There were 19,000 people there. They recovered 13 weapons, all of which were just turned over very quickly, and there was no incidents at all. But because of this perception, there were really substantial delays in executing on the priorities that had put into place in the plan. Another thing that you got along similar lines was restrictions on freedom and freedom of movement. So emergencies are an interesting thing, and there's all kinds of old conceptions about what you can do in disasters or real emergencies or wartime situations. Can you, for example, have martial law that displaces civil authorities and the military really runs the show? What does it mean to have martial law? And these are a lot of questions that are very much unanswered in a lot of our constitutional history because we haven't had a lot of incidents where we've really had to figure this out. But one thing that happens if you think that chaos, violence, looting are the norm is you're more likely to resort to kind of these extreme emergency measures. And in fact, you had a number of mayors and parish leaders in the New Orleans general area who said, we're now under martial law. And their instructions, they didn't really know exactly what that meant. Martial law had no meaning under Louisiana law. It has no clear meaning under the Constitution. So they said, we're under martial law, and to our police officers, that means you can do whatever it takes to get things under control. So you had this sort of interesting displacement of civil authority with we're not quite sure what. The police officers maybe not having to follow Miranda rights or other rules about search and seizure, some idea that the normal conditions had been suspended. So not only that, but you had curfews and all kinds of other restrictions on movement, including police officers in suburbs who are watching this coverage in the news and saying, you know what, we don't want any of those New Orleanians coming and evacuating from New Orleans into our suburbs. So we're going to go blockade those bridges. So they went and they blocked the Crescent City Bridge, which was a main escape route for a lot of people who were trying to come out of New Orleans. They shot over the heads of people who were trying to evacuate. You might have heard later there were a number of New Orleans police officers who were prosecuted for actually shooting people under these conditions, people they alleged they thought were looters. And so you had this sort of interesting sort of mentality switch that happened among law enforcement because they thought what we were encountering were these really kind of extreme conditions. And that justified suspending a lot of normal rules about how we conduct ourselves, freedom of movement, people's freedom to move around, and just sort of basic humanitarian notions about what we ought to be doing in the aftermath of disasters. So I have lots of other things we could talk about, but I see that there's some questions, and I'm happy to answer those. Yeah.
Could you expound maybe just a little more on martial law? So if the mayor declares martial law, that means like his civil servants can go and take care of business, whereas federal troops can't. Is there a separation?
Yeah, so again, we don't really know what they thought they were doing because martial law it's not something you can look up in the Louisiana Code. It's not something you can even go and look up in the federal code. There's no set definition of martial law. And there's a lot of different discussions of what that might mean. One thing it might mean is that the civil authorities have been displaced, and so military officers can execute the law and arrest people and have those kind of authorities that normally only civil police have. So that's kind of one conception of martial law. Another conception, which seems to be sort of what these officers had in mind, is you're not bound by normal constitutional principles. So whatever normally restricts the police in executing the law in terms of how you can do search and seizures and Miranda rights, how you can arrest people, how you can hold people, how quickly you have to arraign them, all of that is sort of suspended for some periods of time. So a notion of suspension of normal constitutional protections. And even sort of more extreme version of martial law would be the idea that after all of this happens and we suspend your constitutional protections, you're not entitled to a normal court when you get tried. Instead of being tried in a normal civilian court or a normal criminal court, you would be tried by some kind of military tribunal. So that's a whole other step. Even after the disaster is kind of sorted out, could we try people outside of our normal civil processes? An even more extreme version of martial law is that the military can essentially take over all the decision-making and displace civil authority entirely. We have never seen that conception here. I would hope that we wouldn't, because that's pretty much a coup, right? The military is taking over the government at that point. So we don't have a lot of sort of firm constitutional cases from which to reason about this. Lincoln, to a certain extent, did some smaller suspensions of normal civil procedures during the Civil War, purported to suspend civilian courts in some areas that were in rebellion. And you got a little bit of case law that came out of that, but not enough to get a firm sort of conception of what these different concepts of martial law might mean, whether any of them are permissible under normal constitutional principles or even under abnormal constitutional principles. The Constitution does allow for some suspension of normal remedies. There's a clause in the Constitution called the suspension clause that says when Congress basically makes certain findings about a state of rebellion, then they can suspend remedies. But here you didn't have Congress acting. It's normally thought of as a congressional power. Can the executive do that? That was a big debate during the Civil War. Can the executive do this, or do they have to have Congress on board? And in the Civil War, the executive, the president, did it, and eventually the Congress sort of approved it. So a lot of really interesting legal and historical questions that are bound up with this very complex and kind of vague notion of what martial law is. But obviously these mayors who were declaring it, I think, didn't have any of this kind of sense of history. They just thought, it's a crisis. And in a crisis, you kind of do what you have to do to secure law and order. That seemed to be the basic attitude. Yeah?
I want to ask, those statutes you talked about earlier, do you think that we need to better define those, like when it's meant to be used? Or are we just blaming the media for sensationalizing the real situation?
Yeah, so, I mean, part of the question is, what do you do about any of these problems, right? And one of the things that happened after this crisis was a continuing belief that law and the chaos that basically reigned in New Orleans. And so there was a big push to actually amend the Insurrection Act to make it clear that natural disasters like hurricanes, can cause looting and violence that would justify invocation of the Insurrection Act and justify the president in seizing control of National Guard units from states and also using those Guard troops and federal military as police. So you actually got that passed in the immediate aftermath, which to my mind is moving in the wrong direction, because again, it's this accepting basic assumptions, which I think are not true, about the kind of consequences that natural disasters cause. It turned out that that was a short-lived law because the governors of the nation were very, very upset about an expansion of the ability of the president to seize control of their National Guard unit. So as a political matter, it was that law had a very short life. But it wasn't repealed on the basis of, oh, look, it turns out we actually have some misconceptions about how common violence is in the aftermath of natural disasters. It was overturned on federalism kind of grounds, basically. So to my mind, some of what the solutions are in this context is making it harder to trigger certain uses of the military, like using them as disaster police without better sort of substantive findings about the amount of chaos that's happening, harder to trigger sort of strict curfews. Another thing that happened in this context is because they thought looting was such a problem, they wouldn't let people back into New Orleans for a very long period of time. And this is pretty common if you look at other hurricanes and disasters. They often say, we can't let people back into their neighborhoods yet because looting is going to be such a problem. And it's true, looting might be some level of problem, but their sense of it is usually overblown. And so they're weighing the risk of looting against the delay for people in getting back in their homes, which is delay is bad for people for a whole host of reasons. They want to get back to their lives. But also, if you're talking about a place, my sister lost everything in Hurricane Ike down in Galveston. And by the time they were allowed back, and the rules let them go back and look, their house was nothing but mold. Because you're talking about very humid climates where there have been water, and the water had long since drained, but there had been about 2 weeks of black mold growing in their house. So rather than having something to salvage, everything was a total loss. And that happens a lot to hurricane survivors because our conception is we can't let people back in yet. We have to really secure the area. We need to make sure we have National Guard troops and extra police officers, and those are resources that are hard to muster up in the aftermath of a disaster. So we're not going to let people back in, and that means they don't get to go and try and salvage whatever is left of their lives until there's really not much left. Other people have questions? Yeah.
So, given the circumstances as they were, not as the media reported them,
Sure.
would you consider, like, would you advise any changes in the law itself, or would you just advise going along as planned?
As planned. So in the paper that I wrote about this, I proposed a number of changes to laws, both about how we trigger use of our military to make it harder in natural disaster situations to invoke things like the Insurrection Act without clear evidence that law and order is really breaking down. I also suggest in our prioritization, we have a lot of national response frameworks and all kinds of sort of policy frameworks for how we respond that we really ought to make clear that we always prioritize life-saving over property protection, which is something that very much got lost in the shuffle when you start saying looting is the big problem, we need to protect people's property, while there were still a lot of flood victims out there on the roofs who escaped from their attics and didn't have water or other supplies. I suggest that we ought to change some of the ways that things are prioritized, as well as making it harder if you're going to invoke a delay or a curfew where you really have to cite more evidence to do that. So there's other things in other areas which I didn't get to touch on, which I also propose changing. Another interesting thing that you often get in this context is right after you have a disaster like this, it's sort of an opportunity because people have a sense of crisis, and you can use that. Disaster sociologists often talk about these events as focusing events, and you get a certain amount of legislative momentum to make changes. And I would suggest that the kind of changes we need to make are mostly focused on how we use our land, how we rebuild, what our building codes look like, but instead that legislative will often gets channeled, I think for some obvious reasons, toward things like looting. So we're going to pass a new looting law. We're going to increase the penalties for looting, which to me is very much kind of symbolic legislation, right? It doesn't actually accomplish anything. It doesn't usually address real problems that have really been manifest during the disaster, but it looks like the legislature is doing something. And you kind of squander that legislative will to a certain extent to get something more and better done. And then we end up rebuilding a community essentially the way that it used to look, except maybe a little poorer for a lot of these communities. And that's a real problem in my mind, because the cost of disasters in this country are increasing at a rate that is simply not sustainable from an economic perspective. We can't continue with business as usual in terms of disaster losses and where we build along coasts and rivers and other things. Anybody else? Yeah.
To what extent was racism a part of
an important part, I think.
and also, to what extent is the response delays and simply due to institutional things? Anyone who's been in the Army understands that when you move a large organization, it just takes forever. And to what extent is it due to other factors, paranoia?
Sure. So this is Professor Lynn Wordle, who you are all welcome to talk to after. He's one of our great professors here. So he asked about racism, which I think there's no question that white America was quicker to believe these stories about poor African-American New Orleans than we might have been about some other cities. Nonetheless, you can track some of the same kind of coverage in a lot of other kinds of disasters. But I think there is no doubt that racism had a big impact on exactly how far and how virulent these kind of stories went, how quickly they traveled, how easily they were believed. But I think having this general kind of background sense that this is what happens in disasters gave people sort of an acceptable framework for asserting that these kind of things were happening, which would have been harder, I think, without a background kind of assumption that these are typical kind of responses. I think it would have gotten challenged more. I think it would have been less socially acceptable to say a lot of the things that were said without the kind of background presumption that this is how disaster behavior looks. And sure, there were a lot of really complicated things that went into why the federal government's response to Katrina was late and inadequate, and it was both of those things. And some of it are institutional concerns, some of it was federalism sort of clashes between the federal government and our national government about who was responsible for what. And there's been some effort to clarify some of those things and to give the federal government what FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, calls a forward-leaning posture. So we're ready to go. We've got things in place. We're not waiting for the states to ask exactly what they need for before we provide resources and other things along those lines. So I think there are a lot of factors that played into the poor Katrina response and the slow Katrina response. And this is just one of them. But it was a not insignificant one if you look at the discussions about why it took us 4 days to get a significant number of troops on the ground. There were a lot of discussions about the fact that how can we send soldiers in without their guns, and you told us they can't take their guns, or at least they're not supposed to raise their guns and they're not supposed to use them, into very chaotic conditions where we expect that they are going to have clashes with leaders and predators on the street. So I think it was a factor. It certainly wasn't the only factor. So lots of interesting other questions that we address in disaster law about federalism and who's really responsible for disasters and who really ought to be running a response, and if there's ways to make that happen more smoothly. Yeah.
So were the soldiers not allowed to just take guns, but like other modes of self-defense as well? Like were they?
So most of them actually carried guns, despite the fact that the Insurrection Act had not been invoked. And so I think to a certain extent that was kind of the compromise position. I think National Guard units carry guns a lot of times, even though one of their big jobs is, in fact, disaster response. States often use their National Guard units for response, and they're often carrying weapons. And, there's a question about, could they have used them in self-defense, even without invoking the Insurrection Act? I think probably yes. But there was a lot of sense that what was happening on the ground was that the troops with those guns were policing New Orleans as though it were Baghdad. And they were raising their guns. You had I'm blanking on the name of the general who was in charge, but he reports having to say to soldiers, lower your guns. These are American citizens. We are not, in fact, in Baghdad, right? And so you got this kind of uneasy compromise in a way. And I think soldiers didn't know exactly what was expected of them. And they had heard these reports like everybody else. And they were nervous about what things looked like on the ground. Yeah.
How is the media held accountable for their reporting of disasters?
Well, how do you think? Not really much at all, right? I mean, we have a First Amendment, and so, one way in some countries you could go about this is you could clamp down on media coverage in the aftermath of disasters or try to redirect it in a certain way and change information flow. We don't do that in the U.S. I don't think it's a good policy thing to do in any event, even were we not constrained by the First Amendment. And I think there's been some self-examination, some reflectiveness that happened in the media after this. You had some conferences of media professionals who said, look, we really fell down on the job in some of these situations. But you can have some sympathy for people in these situations too. It's hard to check your facts. Communications are sort of in disarray. It's a complicated situation in which to be reporting as well. And again, because we do have these kind of background notions about things the way things happen, I think there's a tendency to believe things and maybe not to fact check. But I'm not sympathetic. I'm a little bit sympathetic because it's hard and you have conditions to do the kind of things that you would normally do to check the story. But anybody else? Yeah.
So I heard a lot of the reports of people reporting seeing foreign troops in the area and stuff. What is kind of the legality of that? Is a lot of that just
foreign troops?
Yeah.
So I don't actually remember seeing very much about foreign troops. So this was a problem for the U.S. this was one of the first major disasters in which other countries had offered us aid. And it turned out we had no mechanisms in place to accept other people's aid. We weren't used to being in this position. We were usually being asked for foreign aid, not being offered it. And so we actually didn't have procedural mechanisms in place to receive it the way that a lot of countries do. I don't remember very much about foreign troops being reported. One thing that you did see a fair amount of was basically private security agencies that were performing a security role in Iraq, also being hired to be in neighborhoods in New Orleans. So some privatization of police authority that was happening as well. And I think there are, I haven't thought in very much detail about that whatever constitutional constraints there might be on that. But it is an interesting legal question to what extent the U.S. government has authority to hire sort of private security and then give them a lot of authority in terms of arrests and other things in domestic conditions. And it's not something I thought a lot about, but certainly an interesting issue about privatization of law enforcement. We have questions about privatization of law enforcement in a lot of countries, in a lot of contexts, privatization of prisons and other things as well. But I don't remember anything about foreign troops, but there was the sense that there were people on the ground that worked for the military, and people couldn't figure out exactly who these gun-wielding people were, and a lot of them did turn out to be private security agents. So there was some of that. All right, well, I think we have time to mingle and talk some more and answer questions about law school. There's quite a few professors here. I think also a few of our students, at least one here, right, who's any other current BYU students? Not too many. So we'll have to go out and call and find just some if you want a student to talk to, and we could do that. But welcome the chance to sort of hang out, come have some refreshments, and